If God is one, then who is Yeshua? When discussing the topic of the one God and the unity between God and Yeshua, we need to be extremely careful because if not explained correctly, one can give the impression that there are other gods, introducing polytheism, the belief in more than one God. According to Proverbs 8, someone is speaking and states that the Lord possessed him in the beginning of his way before his works of old, and that he was brought forth when there were no depths, and that he was by him as one brought up with him, and that he was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him. With this being said and cross-referencing Proverbs 8 with Proverbs 30, where it says, "Who had ascended up into heaven, or descended? Who had gathered the wind in his fists? Who bound the waters in a garment? Who established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is his son's name, if thou canst tell?" One can safely conclude from these passages of the Scriptures that God brought forth someone and declared him his son. The Son of God was brought forth from God, not created, and when one is brought forth, one takes on the very nature and essence of the one who brought him forth. "I was brought forth by my Father, therefore, I am of the very nature and essence of the one who brought me forth, but I am a son." The Son of God being brought forth from God would imply that he is of the very nature and essence of the one who brought him forth, but God declared him his son. And nowhere in the Scriptures did God ever address his Son as God, and it is clear from the Scriptures that he declared and revealed him to Peter as the Son of God, and this is important because we have to understand that God is one. If God had addressed Yeshua as God, it would go against the words that proceeded out of his mouth. "There is no other God before me, after me, or beside me." So, when speaking about Yeshua, we need to address him as the Son of God and not God, so that we do not give the impression that there are two gods. Another thing is that when Yeshua told Philip, "He that hath seen me hath seen the Father," that was a true statement he made because he is of the nature and essence of the one who brought him forth. He is the image of the invisible God, but he is the Son of God, and God addressed him as his Son and never as God. He declared and revealed Yeshua as his Son, and as previously stated, if God would have addressed him as God, it would go against God's own words, that there is no other God before me, after me, or beside me. The majesty, the holiness and the transcendent glory of the one God dwell in Yeshua whom he brought forth, which makes an absolute statement that he is of the nature and essence of the one who brought him forth. That he is deity and of divine nature, but God declared and revealed him as his Son, and we must do the same so that we do not give the impression that there are two gods. Yeshua, who was brought forth from God and who is the image of the invisible God, is the Son of God. The Son of God sits at the right hand of the Father with the majesty, the holiness, and the transcendent glory of the one true God, but the Scriptures make it clear that God declared and revealed Yeshua as his Son and not as God, and this is important because it reflects on God being one. To address Yeshua as God, one is giving the impression of there being two gods, introducing polytheism, the belief in more than one God. Genesis 1 verses 26 to 27 tells us that God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness," so God created man in his own image. Analyzing the grammatical structure in these two verses while cross-referencing verse 26 with Proverbs 8 and verse 27 with Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. It is safe to state the following. God, who is one, used the words us and are to make it clear that the one whom he brought forth was by him and with him, and to understand from verse 27 where he does not use the words us and are to refer to God creating man in his own image, so that it can reflect back to God being one. It is clear from Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 that the Lord God is one, which allows no room for a polytheistic view of the one God, so it would be incorrect to address Yeshua as God because God is one, but correct to say that he who was brought forth from God is of the very nature and essence of the one who brought him forth. God never addressed Yeshua as God, he declared and revealed him as his Son, who was present from the beginning before the world came into existence. In addition, even though Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 gives the impression of some kind of unity within the one God, what is important to know is the assertion that the Lord God, the God of Israel, is absolutely and without question one God, and the verse emphatically focuses on one God. John 1 verse 1 reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Even though John is implying that the Word was eternal and with God from the beginning before the world was, he did not say, the Word was God. According to the Greek interlinear, the last part of the verse reads as follows, God was the Word. This is important because to say that the Word was God would imply that there was another God in God's presence. If we can or are to conclude from Proverbs 8 that God brought forth a son, then his Son is of the very nature and essence from whom he was brought forth, which would reflect back to God being one. Even though Yeshua is of the nature and essence of the one who brought him forth, God declared and revealed him as his Son. So we are to address Yeshua as the Son of God and not God, because there cannot be another God before him, after him, or beside him, and to address him as God, one introduces polytheism, the belief in many gods. Many quote 1 Timothy 3 verse 16 to establish their argument to prove that God was manifested in the flesh. But the Greek interlinear makes it clear that Yeshua was the one who was manifested in the flesh. The Apostle Paul was making an affirmation that the Son of God became flesh. And he understood that the Son of God was of the nature and essence of the one who brought him forth and was declared the Son of God by God himself, and by declaring him as his Son, it reflects back to God being one. Let me also mention that if God sits on his throne, then who sits on the throne that God promised David, that a king would sit on his throne forever to rule over God's people, Israel? Either there are two gods, one sitting on God's throne and the other sitting on the throne that God promised David, or the Son of God is the one sitting on the throne that was promised to David. Now you can understand what was revealed to David when he said, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit thou on my right hand." It is clear from the Scriptures that the Son of God is of the very nature and essence of the one who brought him forth, but God declared and revealed him as his Son, so it can reflect upon God being one. One day, I asked God to enlighten my mind so that I could explain this concept to others, and the Spirit of God enlightened my mind with an understanding of this truth through a tiny cell, the amoeba. The amoeba is a cell that has the ability to alter its shape, and as it alters its shape, it splits into two separate cells, and what is brought forth is an exact copy of itself with the exact DNA. The Son of God was brought forth from God, therefore, he is of the very nature and essence of the one who brought him forth, but God declared and revealed him as his Son, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." I hope that the Spirit of God enlightened your mind with the understanding that Yeshua is the Son of God who was brought forth from God. And that being brought forth would imply that he is of the very nature and essence of the one who brought him forth, but that God declared and revealed him as his Son and not as God to make it clear that there are no other gods before him, after him, or beside him. So that one does not give the impression that there are two gods, and by addressing Yeshua as the Son of God, Deuteronomy 6 verse 4 makes it clear that God is one. Written by Samuel Cahigas in collaboration with Luis Cahigas.